When we think about agents today, it's about systems that can reason, they can plan, they can execute multi-step workflows with or without oversight. And I think the key thing here is that where enterprises are today is they require oversight. We want to get to a world where they require less and less oversight, but we still want to maintain enterprise-grade security and the recourse for auditability, traceability, and explainability across those agents. I think the demo is super easy, right? We live in a world where if you think about demos or applications that consumers would be happy with, it's relatively general and uniform. And I think when you get into the world of I have an enterprise configuration that might be using specific software, whether that's in-house, whether that is a third-party configuration, and I have something very bespoke to how my enterprise has ways of working, it starts to break apart rather quickly. And just giving any LLM like unfederated access to these systems without understanding what the procedure ought to look like results in a lot of variability. And I think for a lot of enterprises, variability is not necessarily where they want to go.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Future Proof. Today, I sit down with Elliott Choi, who's the Director of Product at Cohere. We talk about how they're finding enterprise adoption with AI agents in general. We talk about some of the important characteristics for agents when they're being adopted by enterprises, including observability and traceability, how to frame agent behaviors in terms of guardrails and workflows, and how to permission data so that unintended access is not possible by those agents as well. We also cover memory and how important memory is to building more effective agents over time, making sure that agents can learn from past successful processes and become a more effective part of your team. Really excited for you to hear from Elliott, and stay tuned. All right. Hey everyone, welcome back to Future Proof. Today I'm here with Elliott Choi. He's the Director of Product at Cohere. Elliott, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Excited to talk today.
Yeah. So wanted to first start by saying congratulations on your recent fundraise, $500 million. Very exciting for the future of Cohere. I'm curious what you're most excited about in terms of what that might unlock for Cohere.
Yeah, I think the funding was definitely a great move in our direction. I think it allows us to really expand our teams. I think we made a couple announcements recently about expanding offices in Asia. And I think this capital will definitely be helpful in expanding our presence, both in engineering, but also go to market in those regions. I think in general, having more capital has allowed us to bring on some very key personnel, such as Joel and Francois, to the team. And it also allows us to have access to more compute, which allows us to run more experiments, to, even if you're not serving the largest models, I think access to more capital allows you to run more concurrent experiments where limitations on the capital perspective could mean that you have to pick and choose on which experiments you want to run.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that as a foundation model creator or creating a family of models at Cohere, that capital will be super important for training the next generation of models as well. But today, though, I want to talk specifically about kind of your AI agent products and discuss what that looks like in terms of designing and architecting those agents at Cohere and really unlocking your customers to build those as well. I want to start at the foundation. Like, how would you define an AI agent when you're building for enterprise or government? Is the right mental model like a repeatable workflow where LLMs are sprinkled into that? Is it a co-pilot? Is it another coworker that you're working with? How would you define these agents?
Yeah. So I think the first thing, so taking a step back, is there are a lot of confusion around agents, I think primarily because of the different myriad of definitions that we see from foundation model players, hyperscalers, or even application level providers. And then when you shift into the context of building for the enterprise, agents is also a quite overloaded term, just simply because when you're selling to enterprise, it's a completely different grade of building compared to consumers, where there's a lot higher risk tolerance, I would say, on the consumer side. The way we think about AI agents in the enterprise is that it's very different from consumer chatbots, right? Consumer chatbots, I would say, historically have been these decision trees, and then LLMs allowed you to do away with the decision tree. It was like one step removed from that. But when we think about agents today, it's about systems that can reason, they can plan, they can execute multi-step workflows with or without oversight. And I think the key thing here is that where enterprises are today is they require oversight. We want to get to a world where they require less and less oversight, but we still want to maintain enterprise-grade security and the recourse for auditability, traceability, and explainability across those agents. I think at Cohere, we have various different product features that allow agentic capabilities without going all the way to an autonomous agent in a system. And that's the way we're designing and building for enterprise.
Got it. Yeah, and that totally makes sense that at the enterprise level, auditability, traceability would be super important. I'm curious like how you incorporate those like at a product level into your agent builder or maybe even the observability tools that you offer there. What have you found are most important to enterprises?
Let's use the two ways that you can build in agentic capabilities into North, which is our agentic AI platform. We have Agent Builder, which I think is very similar to a majority of applications these days, where you can create a custom agent, give it a set of tools that it can reason over and use as like runtime. And then we have our automation platform, right? And with the AI Builder, every agent has traceability built into it. Every chat conversation it has, down to the tool calls and the reasoning trace of which tool calls and why to execute those tool calls. And we find that to be very important as you're a developer or someone in the center of excellence who's looking to debug an agent that they've created and understand from the feedback that they're getting from the users, whether it's doing a good job or a poor job. When it comes to our automation platform, we think of these as like much more scoped agentic capabilities, right? And in here, you're typically looking at these complex business processes that could sometimes be touching critical workloads, where you want the agent to operate where a human would have previously reasoned. However, when you're looking at these complex business processes, they're not born out of thin air, right? They probably have some procedure that 9 out of the 10 times ought to be followed. And in here, it's more about making sure the execution trace of the graph is correct and that there's reasoning traceability around the agent itself. So that node that does like the human thinking around that. But the DAG itself is relatively straightforward in terms of capturing the sequence of events, whether it's sequential, whether it's conditional, whether there's cycles in it. So I think like from a traceability auditability standpoint, we think about it in the two veins of I have an agent, I'm going to give it some tools and it's going to be able to reason over that, but there's no defined path and I want to keep it open-ended. Whereas when you're moving to an automation where likely you're automating something where there's a pretty clear defined path, maybe some degrees of freedom around it, but you generally know from going point A to B what those end steps and end degrees of freedoms look like. It's a different level of traceability where you're looking for decision making and then you're looking for more like a reasoning trace on the agent side on what tools it chose to invoke. And then in terms of observability, it really depends, right? I think you face in an agentic platform two issues with observability, which is that you have to separate system logs, which are just is the system functioning as it occurs, and also traceability for sensitive information. And making sure that the developer is able to get access to both, but scoped access where they're not getting access to all of the information plugged into an automation, when realistically they need to figure out why a tool call failed and not necessarily like the PII that goes into that information. So we're thinking about separating those two work streams, even though both are still critical in the agent development process and North as a system.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And there's so many threads to pull there. I want to revisit permissioning and data access in a little bit later. I'm curious, like I imagine in those cases where you have an LLM replacing an existing human process, that for companies that already have those well-defined playbooks of some business process that they want to automate within the agent builder or in North, that is quite easy to replace, or it's just more effective because they have a defined playbook or process in place. Like, for example, a customer service process that must be followed. I imagine like for those well-defined processes up front, like it's just more effective in general.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's more effective for a number of reasons. I think enterprises are much more on board with that level of automation and that level of, they're really looking to replace unknown. And as well from like a ROI metric standpoint, there's a clear North Star of like tickets closed or CSAT scores that allow you to justify whether or not the automation is or the agentic capabilities are progressing in a positive direction. Whereas a lot of the times when you have this like blanket agentic capability, let's say I have this AI agent that's connected to my email and connected to our Salesforce. If I'm able to write emails quicker or send more calendar invites and things like that, it's a lot harder to tie that metric explicitly to an ROI.
Yeah, that makes sense. Does that kind of have to do with how there's a gradient of options before you have an autonomous agent just working alongside you in the workforce? Like, what do you think is missing for us to get to that stage? Is it that the model capability isn't quite there, or is it that there's just not enough process to optimize or something to really achieve and show value? What do you think it takes to get there?
I think a lot of literature out there is, and videos, and then different experts have gone on to, I think, a lot of podcasts or videos or talks to really talk about this. But I think the demo is super easy, right? We live in a world where if you think about demos or applications that consumers would be happy with, it's relatively general and uniform. And I think when you get into the world of I have an enterprise configuration that might be using specific software, whether that's in-house, whether that is a third-party configuration, and I have something very bespoke to how my enterprise has ways of working, it starts to break apart rather quickly. And just giving any LLM like unfederated access to these systems without understanding what the procedure ought to look like results in a lot of variability. And I think for a lot of enterprises, variability is not necessarily where they want to go. They're more like risk off, right? You have an existing procedure. You want to really make sure that before you move that procedure to a net new procedure, it's always going to be reliable. It's always going to be helpful, and you have an understanding of the entire scope of costs. Even if the LLM's out of the box, given unfederated access to your systems and maybe some brochure or procedure manual to follow, what a lot of the times people are realizing is that if you have the procedure, which is essentially a DAG at that point with conditionals or things to check or things to follow against, spelling that out for the model creates a more efficient path for the model to follow. And so it's this thing where even if the model was intuitively able to reason every single time what trace it ought to follow, it's simpler sometimes to just explicitly direct the agents in the direction that you want it to go through and just have it like reason where it needs to reason, more of cost-saving perspective.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And speaking of kind of constraining agents, reducing variability, I'm sure that you've seen a lot of types of implementations of agents, just seeing customers use the agent builder. I'm curious where you see most people or customers get architecture wrong, or what kind of like general advice that you have when you guide customers through building agents or setting up the tool calls or the prompting or even multi-agent sort of systems. What are the facets that you feel like people aren't getting right about the architecture?
Yeah. There's a couple things. I think there's an architectural problem. There's also an end user thinking problem. I would say the first thing about like the end user thinking is that when you create an agent and generically put it out there and have any end user in your enterprise using the agent, you have to account for all the variability coming in from a prompting perspective. So some people are going to be incredibly prescriptive, and some people are going to be incredibly vague, right? And so one thing that is really important, even from an architecture standpoint, irrespective of what you're building, is to account for the fact that some people are going to give your model like little to no context, your agent, little to no context to operate off of, and to make sure that your agent is always trying to gather enough context before it ends up making a decision of what sources or tools for it to call. Whereas like some people are incredibly prescriptive, and so then the agent doesn't have to ask follow-up questions. If you're looking for a certain customer and you search by first name, but like you use a generic name like John, you shouldn't just search through Salesforce or something for John. You're going to get millions of things to come back from, and your agent needs to respond and account for the fact that different people have different levels of comfortability when working with LLMs and will be overly specified or underly specified. The second thing is that a lot of the times people think about, I would say, agents as just like glorified chatbots, right? And they don't think about the fact that, yes, your model or your agent could use a lot of its reasoning tokens or its budget or its can burn a lot of input tokens, iterating through a bunch of different tools or data sources for it to look through. However, if you provide a little bit more context around, oh, we have this data source and this data source typically houses this type of information, it allows the model to have better context with reasoning, similar to a human. When I work at Cohere, we do a lot of our work in Notion or G Drive or things like that. And I have a rough understanding of what types of documents we house in G Drive, what types of documents we house in Notion, versus just a blanket, oh, G Drive is an amorphous blob store where you can have Excel, CSV, and PowerPoints and PDFs in it. So being as prescriptive around building in context that a human would have around the data sources that you are connecting is vitally important. And then I would say the other one is when building an agent for a demo, it's really easy to understand from a security perspective. You have a file, maybe you have a G Drive with a folder with 3 files in it, but the moment you start thinking about, I have an amorphous folders that have to have its own permissioning, and then I'm going to mix in other sort of data sources, but the data sources between the person creating the file versus the person accessing the agents or might be different. I think they also miss that, and I think that's usually a really large blocker from going demo to production for a lot of these customers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you touched on a few things there. I think describing the data sources makes a ton of sense because intuitively we have an internal sense of like where our knowledge lives across our different tools. So in addition to maybe describing like the types of data sources that it can access rather than giving it like full grep or just being able to search any kind of document repository you might have, I'm curious like how once you actually have the document and you've found a relevant piece of text that you want to load in, how should people think about managing that context? Let's say the document is quite large, and mixed into that is a bunch of facts that the agent may need to reference in its answer or in its tool call. What are some of the best practices you're finding to ground it in that data while also appropriately managing context and a reasonable amount of tokens?
Yeah. So we've made quite a lot of investments at Cohere for RAG. It's something that in every single model performance model release, we always make sure that we're state of the art in terms of RAG performance, whether it's long context, whether it's single document. This is where I think a lot of data pre-processing can help. And so when you're dealing with, let's say, very short documents, the way you load the data into the agent is a little bit more free in the sense that you can probably fit it directly into context. But when you're dealing with a much longer, let's say, document, there are things from that document that can help aid sort of pools of, I would say, ways of cutting that document down. So an example would be, let's say you have a PDF. The PDF is 5,000 pages, but there's table of contents or sections, right? And instead of loading all that into context, there's a way of separating that document into pockets and only loading what is necessary at the time. And also having sort of separate agents. If you ask, let's summarize this entire document, trying to split that context through subagents in order to manage a task like that. And also managing like memory in terms of conversation, right? Like you obviously want to have long flowing, long context conversations where you can have 1,000 messages between the agent and the user, offloading as much of that into sort of semantic memory that can be referenced throughout the conversation allows you to shed a little bit of that context length as the conversation continues to progress.
Got it. And in general, how do you think about designing memory for agents? There's obviously the conversational memory component, but are agents in Cohere generally stateless across different conversations, or is there also a concept of long-term memory that you would need to capture in order to increase the agent's effectiveness over time?
Yeah, I would say today our agents are stateful, but we haven't fully unlocked how we want memory to work, I would say. Where we're definitely headed is this idea of both procedural and semantic memory. So think about semantic memory as facts or events in our conversation, and then procedural are like ways of working with the agent that are most efficient or that are preferable. If I like summarizing documents in 3 paragraphs, it's more procedural than we had a conversation last week about what I want to do when I go on vacation, right? And so splitting that up as separate things that an agent can pick off of when interacting with a user is vitally important. And then housing that in a sort of, we have a semantic search apparatus or just a search apparatus called Compass, storing that as in separate indexes for the model to use as a tool call to invoke, hey, user has asked me something, let me look through my procedural memory bank. Is there something that we've done here before? And it's where we're headed from a long-term memory and an agent perspective.
Yeah, I like that idea of procedural memory. I'm curious, have you given much thought about how to expose that back to users? I think for semantic memory, there's with the table of facts, maybe it's a little bit more straightforward to allow users to customize what is remembered. What does that look like for procedural memory?
Yeah, there's a variety of ways to do it. From our perspective, the easiest way to do it is getting the user to just confirm, right? I think when the model elicits or the agent believes it has elicited a procedural memory fact, it's very simple to just get confirmation from the user, hey, is this something that you would like? And then have the user actually decide whether or not that this is something they want to elicit, essentially graduate it from an implied procedure into a respected procedure for the agent. Yeah.
Got it. And then that becomes like a sort of a reusable process that can then be referenced later and saved and snapshotted back to the agent's sort of repository of processes that it knows of.
Exactly.
Cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to come back to the permissioning and data security points that you brought up. Obviously, with demos, it can be quite easy if it's a single user accessing an agent. And like you said, it becomes much more complex when the authoring developer like has different scopes than other people that are working with the agent. How are you thinking about permissioning and data access when there's multiple users within a company involved?
Yeah. So the way we've designed North is that your agent, when you're creating it, obviously as the person creating the agent, you have certain permissions that you're allowed to use, right? And it would be a huge miss on our perspective if that sort of changes or is wiped the moment that agent is created, because then you have to manage RBAC mixed in with sort of your SSO or your IDP on that agent level. One thing I think that is pretty unique of the way we built North is that when a agent is created and it's connected to a data source, it is linked to your SSO such that any user accessing it will only see the subset that they are allowed to see from the actual raw data source rather than wiping it and managing it on the application layer of North, which means that in real time, if let's say you have a Google Drive folder and you realize that someone shouldn't have access to it and you turn that off, it's not that person can't use the agent anymore. It's that agent, when that user is interacting with it, will refuse to ground on documents or even search through documents that the user doesn't have access to in real time compared to the data source. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love that connection with the SSO integration as well, like where users' identities are persisted or understood across different users that are talking to the agent. This is very relevant for us at Paragon too. We serve a lot of customers that are doing this sort of data ingestion process for the purpose of LLM guided search. And we recently released a permissions API on top of some of these services like Google Drive in these cases where even an organizational admin might actually authorize on behalf of an entire company, and you would then need to like understand the fine-grained access details between each user and each document. So it's a very thorny problem. We're very familiar with it. And yeah, it's good to know that you all at Cohere are thinking about that too. Yeah, those permissioning models, they can get pretty difficult to work with. There's a lot of types of roles, as we found out.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. I'm curious, the LLM space, agentic space, moving quite fast. Is there an important capability in the next 12 months that you're really looking forward to, or an improvement that you think the space will make in general that will unlock the next level of capabilities from agents?
Yeah. I think memory and landing memory really is going to be incredibly important. I think your agent, in order to be incredibly sticky, has to understand my ways of working over time. And thinking about how every interaction, whether positive or negative, through my interactions with the agent, should shape every interaction that I have moving forward. And I think it's very easy for us to say, hey, we're storing procedural memory or semantic memory in a memory bank, and the agent's going to decide whether or not I can draw on it. But I think like the proof is going to be in the pudding of whether or not I tell you one time that I like to have paragraphs in this certain perspective, and it's going to be respected every single time. And then when there's a drift and maybe I don't want it like that anymore, that we're somehow able to overcome the fact that we've had 30 positive interactions where I wanted paragraphs, 3 paragraphs as an example, or different ways of working. Because I think memory is going to keep your organization at where it is at that point of time, right? Your agent's going to learn your ways of working, but where AI needs to go and agents need to go is also elevating your ways of working, right? So let's say you have 2 customer service representatives and they both have 8 ways of working, and they both have sort of customer tickets coming in and they get resolved at different rates, and the agent learns how those people are working. The memory you capture is going to be a local maximum, right? It's going to optimize and learn how that specific CSM operates. But where the value is going to be is like, how can we do it in such a secure manner? Because you don't want to mix individual prompts and interactions with people, but elevate to the fact that there might be a more efficient way or most efficient way between all these disparate ways that CSMs are operating around these tickets that allows you to have the most efficient, optimal CSAT outcome for this particular use case at hand. And it's not just about the local memory, but it's about this global memory for an agent to move past that ways of working that's been established at your company or your business.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I feel like there's kind of memory, you can split it, right? There's like memory in the process sense, like of how does this agent operate best with a particular team? But then there's also personal memory, like how does this particular person that I'm talking to like to work, or what kind of responses do they like to generate? I think that what I find working with various LLMs is that I have to provide the same types of instructions to each tool. Like I have my custom instructions for each tool and I dump it into each tool. And sometimes I think about maybe there's a world where we have some MCP for personal memories, like that we can access and retrieve across these different tools, so that when I start using, let's say, Cohere Agent Builder, that I don't have to relearn, I don't have to reteach it how I like to work, but that kind of follows me through the different tools I use. Sometimes I like to think about that and wonder if that's possible.
I would also add the way we think about it is if I could go and zoom 3 years into the future, I think that the future 100% is these agents that can be dropped into any context, and it takes either historical or learned context with this memory bank and can figure out new processes and new procedures. I think when you think about the way enterprises adopt technology and them being historically risk off, getting to that world requires a myriad of really small steps in order to build the confidence that you get there. And that's our thinking with automations, because ultimately, what is an automation? An automation is a scoped down version of a fully autonomous agent by giving it rough guardrails of task A to B. And when you give that rough task A to B, every automation outcome can build into your memory. And so you're building this like scaffolding or framework, because at the end of the day, like, where's the huge value in training these LLMs? It all comes down to like traces of going from step A to step B of an unconstrained task, and then feeding that back into your model of these are the steps or the right reasoning trace that you ought to take. And that's where automations really comes into us, where it's like we know where everyone wants to go, which is like I drop 5 agents, the agents have connection to all my tools and can figure out the ways of working and work autonomously. But in order to build there or get to there as an enterprise, you're going to start off with automations. And your automation traces are going to build the traces that will inform the agents of your ways of working and ultimately build that sort of like memory layer.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So the pathway to autonomous agents is going to be a lot of little steps in between, with lots of, especially when working with enterprises. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think the myriad of custom applications, in-house built applications, or just configurations on different stacks is a whole beast in and of itself.
Yeah, and each incremental step towards that path is a huge opportunity as well. A lot of companies are seeking to solve those problems. And yeah, it's just cool to think that we are laddering up to that future. But in the meantime, there will be all these intermediate tools that are available. Cool. Elliott, thank you so much for chatting with us on Future Proof. We really appreciate your insights and excited to see Cohere continue to improve its own AI agent memory and workflows. We're super excited to see that. So thanks for chatting with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube to get all the latest episodes. And to view our past episodes, visit us at useparagon.com/futureproof.